Well, hey, what's up, Bayside Folsom? How are y'all doing this morning? Yeah? That is the sound of people who are sitting in the AC right there. They said, this is a good thing. I don't know. I bet you there's a lot of people out there, y'all love church, but if it was 87 degrees in here, you probably wouldn't be in here, right? Like, I'm with you. I'd be leaving too. I'm so glad we got AC. As I think about that and the triple threat, like 100-degree weather we've been having is absolutely nuts. I got a question for you guys. I want to figure out where my people are at. Where do you guys set your thermostat? Like, I know that half of this room, you're the people who are like, we are going to hold the line, and we are not acting like the AC grows on trees, and the thermostat's set at 78, and that's good enough. Some of y'all are out there, right? Okay, that's okay. We won't shame you. Some of you are like, I'm sweating bullets just thinking about 78 degrees. My house is set to 65 right now. Where are y'all at? You're like, we're just running that. I don't want to get home and then turn it on and have to wait for it to get cool. Like, that's where I'm at. Like, Becca and I, luckily, we're on the same page. Like, we both love keeping our house cool. But sometimes I feel like I'm not a real dad. Like, there's that caricature out there that dads are supposed to be like, hey, don't touch the thermostat. We got bills to pay, and somebody's got to pay for that. We're not going to refrigerate the neighborhood and all. And I'm like, no, run the AC. Like, let it go. But hey, wherever you're at, wherever you set your thermostat, however cool you feel this morning, I'm so glad that you are here hanging out with us at Bayside Folsom. If we do not know each other yet, my name is Jake Bartkovsky. I am just one of the pastors around here, and I consider it such an honor to get to say that. This is my favorite place I've ever worked, favorite place to be a part of. Like, as I look around at who Bayside Folsom is, it's not just the great people that I get to work with, like the students team stacked with Noah Reynolds and Rachel Annis, or our whole team of staff, but I also think about like all of y'all sitting out there, all the people that I get to do life with, that I get to do church with. I think about some of you who are parents, who are parenting high schoolers, and I get to watch you raise high schoolers who love Jesus, and they love to serve, and they love you. And I just go, man, can I be like you someday? Like, my kids are young. Could I parent like you parent? And then I love like hanging out with some of those parents that you're in the thick of it like me. Your kids are young. My kids are 9 and 7 and 7. And I just go, man, I love the way I get to watch you. Like where are you at, Tanner and Heather? Like the way you balance like running a business and being parents and having this, but then also like volunteering in the church and serving and loving your kids. I want to be like that. And then I look around and I see some students who are around here. I see Kalia over here, who Kalia's up here at Breakaway doing the Breakaway dances, and my daughter's 9. She's over here, and she's like, I want to be like Kalia someday. Like, I want to be serving. And I love this stuff. Like, I love that I get to be a part of this church. And so if you don't hear it enough, man, I absolutely love Bayside Folsom. I hope that you have some of the same experiences as you get to know people around here. You just go, I love this place and who we are and what we are about. So I just want to say thank you, church. I love being a part of who we are. Could you guys give it up for yourselves? Like, what an amazing place. If you're new around here, you're going to discover it's great. But hey, one of the things we do, we dive into the Bible, and so this morning, we are diving right back in. We are in the book of Acts. We are in this series studying the book of Acts, and we are in chapter 7. So if you've got a Bible, you got your digital, I'm a digital guy, pull it out, open up to Acts chapter 7, and some of you might be getting worried, because you're like, Acts chapter 7, that is where we were at last week. How have we not moved on? I get it. I'm like that. Sometimes they go, how long is this going to be? But at the same time, I'm really excited that we are still in Acts chapter 7 this week. That Acts chapter 7 is this continuous long sermon, this message that's preached, that's spoken, that's given by a guy named Stephen in response to a question that he has. And we've sliced it up into different like episodes, like that he would talk about different aspects and parts of the history of God's people and who they are and where they've been. And so last week, Brandon did this really good job. He introduced us to the topic. He gave us the story of Abraham, and he went on. And so here we are continuing in Acts chapter 7. It's kind of like if you've ever been to Maui and you've done the road to Hana. It's that 6-hour drive that just takes forever on that windy road. Some of us go, but it's that thing where you go, hey, I've got like a tour guide app on my phone, and every 50 feet they're pointing out something that I got to see. This waterfall that's over here, this flower that's over here, this historical thing that happened over here, and that's what we're doing through the book of Acts. Like, we are taking it slow as we walk through and step through this book, because there's so much for us to glean and to learn. And so we are on episode 2 of Acts chapter 7 this morning. And like I said, Brandon kicked it off last week, and he kicked it off. But I think we need to take a quick step back just to get our footing to see where we're at. We're in Acts chapter 7. We're going to start at verse 8. But if you flip back just a quick page into Acts chapter 6, there's this thing that's said to Stephen at the end. It starts to describe who Stephen is. Stephen's the guy who's giving this sermon, this message. He's talking, he's speaking, and Stephen is described in Acts chapter 6 the way every one of us should want to be described. It says that Stephen was a man full of God's grace and power. It says he was performing great wonders and signs among the people. And I know what you're thinking, he's a real troublemaker, right? Like a hooligan. Like you don't want your kids hanging around this guy. That's how they treated him and acted. Like they threw Stephen, this guy, in front of, they call it the Sanhedrin. Big Bible word, makes us uncomfortable. I don't know what it means, but big Bible word. Kind of like the religious leaders, the Supreme Court, the elite of the day in the religion. They throw him before them. And it says in Acts chapter 6 that they accuse him of this. It says they produced false witnesses. That means liars. They produced liars who testified, this fellow, Stephen, never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs of Moses that were handed down to us. And that's the accusation that is lobbed at Stephen, that he is threatening to tear down this holy place and to change our traditions. And that's why we get to verse 1 in chapter 7, where he simply is asked, is it true? Is it true? Are you doing this? And so for 7 verses last week, we go on all about Abraham, one of, if not the most respected leaders of the faith for those people, to which he points out that God was with Abraham, was working in Abraham long before there was ever a law of Moses or a temple. He points out that God was working through Abraham in far off places. Brandon showed us a map like Mesopotamia, and he said it would be silly for us to think that the God of Abraham, as he was often called, could be kept inside a box, especially when Abraham had never even seen that box. And so we move on from the story of Abraham, and we pick it up in verse 8, where Brandon left off. And here's what it says in chapter 7, verse 8. It says, and Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him 8 days after his birth. And I know Brandon loves that joke, like, hey, we got a video in case you don't know what circumcision is. We're not going to do that, but it is a funny joke. Like, when you look at like what that is and what it means, can you imagine Abraham, your dad comes back and says, hey, God gave me a message. We're going to do something today. What are we doing? We all getting tattoos? No, better. And then he goes, I read a book where the chapter was just simply called, you want to do what to our whats? So we move on from there, this circumcision, this covenant that God had with his people. And it says later, Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob became the father of the 12 patriarchs. And because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, here's what happened. They sold him as a slave into Egypt. But God was with him, and he rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him the ruler over Egypt and all his palace. Then a famine struck all of Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering. And so our ancestors could not find food. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers on their first visit. On the second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was, and Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all. Then Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and our ancestors died. Their bodies were brought back to Shechem, and they were placed in the tomb that Abraham had bought from the sons of Hamor at Shechem for a certain sum of money. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. But then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. Kind of an awkward place for us to leave off there, but I think what it does is it just sets up a really good cliffhanger for the story gets better next week. Make sure you come back for that. But rather than focus on how it ends right there and what continued to happen in all of Egypt based on Joseph and the people of God having traveled down there, could we look at this story of Joseph this morning? Now, reading this story kind of assumes a lot that we would know about Joseph. And maybe you're like me. Maybe you have some ideas about Joseph because you grew up around church. And like you saw the flannel graph where they let you know who Joseph was, and you know he had this really dope coat. It had all those colors on it. It was like this super cool rainbow thing before rainbows were cool. Like it was there. Or maybe you've seen like those movies, the cartoon movie, like The Prince of Egypt. Or maybe you were a kid and you grew up and late at night the infomercial would come on for this traveling like circus of a play called Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Like I remember seeing all these infomercials. Wherever it is that you get your ideas, or maybe you're just totally new to the story of Joseph and you have no idea what we're talking about. Stephen says, let me give you a brief overview. Let me remind you of who Joseph was. But the great thing about this is that as he's telling this story, it's okay because he's telling the story to people who know it. The religious elite would have known the story of Joseph better than he did, if not just as well. And yet what he's doing is he wants to introduce some things to help them learn or notice some things that maybe they had never noticed. You know, as we read this passage, it would be fair for us to get a little overwhelmed. Like there are some things that get mentioned, the sons of Hamor and Shechem and the patriarchs. I go, I have no idea who any of those people are. Like, and if I could level with you for a minute, like when it says the patriarchs, I can't name the 11 brothers of Joseph. Can anybody in here like name the 11 brothers of Joseph? I can't name them, but I'm not worried about it. I know some of you are like, you mean he can't name the 11 brothers? He's a pastor. And don't worry. We've got a real pastor coming back next week. Like, I get that. Like, don't worry. Like, the idea is I'm not worried that I can't name the 11 brothers of Joseph any more than I'm worried that I can't name the 8 reindeer. Like, whenever I get stumped with a question, and you've probably been there, you've been stumped with a question in the Bible. Somebody brings up some obscure fact, and they go, what do you do with two doves on a Tuesday? I don't know. Well, it says it in Deuteronomy 19, don't you know? I don't know. I get stumped with something, or somebody brings up like a big and heavy topic. They go, what do you do with election and predestination and the sovereignty of God? And you go, and I get stumped. But I always come back to this question, this idea that I ask myself is, how would having the answer to that question, how would knowing the names of the 11 brothers of Joseph impact the way that I follow God every day? Yeah, it's great to know the stories. It's great to know how these stories, but how would knowing their names and being able to name them impact the way that I'm loving people in the name of Jesus every day? And the answer is not much. If I could name the brothers of Joseph, it wouldn't make this message any better. It'd make it longer, which might not make it better. But see, the good news is that Stephen isn't simply reciting and telling us this story just to prove what he knows. He's trying to introduce a few things that might feel new, some lessons that we can draw from it, that maybe the Sanhedrin, maybe the religious elite, the people who considered themselves religious, who go to church pretty regularly on Sundays, even in the heat of July, and show up, that these religious people maybe hadn't noticed. And so, hey, you might not know the 11 names of the patriarchs, but here's what you do need to know, is when it says the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, so they sold him into slavery in Egypt, is that the patriarchs were Joseph's 11 brothers. He had 11 brothers. These were not his like tight-knit friends that you call like, hey, we sit together in church, we go to camp, we do it all together, like we're homies. This was like, no, we are actual brothers. We have the same dad. And so all of these brothers of Joseph, from Reuben on down to Benjamin, these 11 guys, they sold Joseph into slavery. And it says they did this, why? Because they were jealous of him. And I have a question for you this morning. What triggers your jealousy? Like, have you ever thought about that? Like, I think we all get those feelings of jealousy from time to time. Sometimes we don't want to admit it. We don't have to raise our hands. We see things on Instagram as we scroll. We hear stories from our friends, and we feel a little bit of that jealousy. And I just wonder this morning if we could ask, what is it that triggers your jealousy? What is it that triggers the jealousy that might have triggered the jealousy for Joseph's brothers, that they would act and behave in such a way that they would sell him into slavery after being talked down from thinking, let's just kill him. Like, that's how jealous they were. And see, the two things that most often come up in the story of Genesis, where we figure out, hey, what was it that made Joseph's brothers jealous? There's two things. Anybody know these two things? Number one, he got a fancy coat, right? Man, my brother got a fancier coat than I got, so now I'm going to kill him. What? Like, that's absolutely great. You got new shoes and I'm jealous? Like, I can get jealous of, like, the clothes that you get or something, but, like, wow, like, that seems over the top, like, wild. But what you discover is that in this story is that this jealousy that was identified and seen through this coat, this fancy coat of many colors that Joseph is given, was that there was something deeper going on, was that there was a jealousy because it just confirmed all of their suspicions that Joe is dad's favorite. Any of you guys have siblings and wonder that sometimes? Which one of my siblings do my parents love more? You laugh, but you go, hey, even if I don't believe it's true, you fight about it, you argue about it. Maybe you're nudging your brother right now going, it's me, But have you ever thought about, from the parent's perspective, what you might be inadvertently doing when you let your kids believe that one of them is your favorite? The kind of animosity, the kind of jealousy, maybe for you, maybe you're like, I don't have any kids yet, but you're thinking about your parents, and you go, do your parents know which one of them you think is your favorite? Like my son Liam, we tell all the time, mom is his favorite. He goes to mom, he loves the color of mom, and I go, you love me too, right? Yeah, Dad, I love you, but mom's mom. And I go, okay. But have you ever thought about, like, the way that you treat your family, the way that you allow someone to believe that maybe this person's my favorite might change and alter the dynamic, that it might lead to this kind of jealousy that might be hurtful? And then the second thing that we get in the story of Genesis is not only were they jealous because he got the sick coat, but they were jealous because Joseph came to them and he said, hey, I've had a dream. I've had these dreams, these visions from God that someday that you are all going to bow down before me. And no one wants to hear that from their youngest kid. Like, hey, mom, dad, guess what? Someday y'all are going to listen to me. I'm going to be the boss of this house. Not anytime soon, kid. Like, and they were upset and they were angry and they heard this. And they were jealous. And so Joseph is in the middle of this family where this dynamic is just tough. Not to mention the fact that in Joseph's family, where there are 12 kids, they're by 4 different women. That his dad has got 4 different wives who he's birthed these kids with. And they're going, man, have you ever thought that your family was a little hard to live in? We got Joseph's family over here. And so if you can imagine being in the middle of this one and the jealousy that might be developing in them. Now, whether the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin who Stephen's talking to, were picking up on it or not, Stephen was really trying to point something out. When he says, hey, check it out, the patriarchs were so jealous of Joseph that they sold him into slavery. He was using that ancient wisdom of the 3rd grader on the playground. You know, the one that says, you're rubber and I'm glue? No, wait, I'm rubber and you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off of me and sticks to you. Like he's saying, you're accusing me of disrespecting, dishonoring the prophets, resisting what God would be doing. He goes, don't you see that that's what you've done to Jesus? Don't you see that that's what the religious people, the religious leaders have done all along? Like we go all the way back to the patriarchs and they resisted Joseph so much that they had sold him into slavery. They kicked their brother out. And so you imagine that these people who should be the most primed, the most ready, the most prepared to hear the message of God, the religious people, are the ones who are trying to silence God, who are trying to resist him, just like the patriarchs who resisted what God was speaking through Joseph. They said, not in my house, like that's not happening. But if we could just pause here for a second. Like I think it would be really easy for us to grow disconnected from this story. Like we could go disconnected because Stephen's trying to point out to the Sanhedrin that we have a long history of being unwilling to change. And when I say we, I mean people and religious people and the church, like we have a long history of going, but we've always done it this way. And he's saying we have a long history of being unwilling to change, and that the people who should have been the most primed, the most ready to hear Jesus, they just straight up reject him. And I'm always reminded of this phrase that Jesus would say over and over again in his ministry. He'd say, you've heard it said, but I tell you. It was like Jesus was saying that your idea, your understanding of the law and the prophets, man, I'm glad that you know it, but I think you've missed it. And I'm a lot like most of you. Like when I hear a story like this, like there's no way I just inherently put myself in the position of the Sanhedrin. That's not me. I'm not religious elite who's rejecting Jesus. I'm on the cutting edge. I'm a pioneer. I'm an early adopter. I want to hear the new thing that God's doing. Like that's who I am. But at the same time, I also know that I tend to think I know a thing or two. Anybody with me? I tend to think that I know what it means to follow God and to read the Bible and who he's called me to be and what that life looks like. And here's the way you should do it. Like if I get real honest, like my wife would say, hey, sometimes I feel like you think you know everything, don't you? Like if you got somebody in your life like that, like I hate that that's who I am to people at times. But I think what Stephen is trying to show the Sanhedrin, trying to show the religious leaders, trying to show what Jesus has said is that maybe you've missed something. Maybe there's something that I might be missing. And so the question that this is leading to is what happens when we get to a place where we're unwilling to change? What happens when you and I are in a place like Joseph's brothers, like the Sanhedrin, like the religious leaders, which I'm unwilling to change? And Stephen says, let me tell you what happens. Egypt is what happens. Egypt, 8 times, in the 10 verses we read, 8 times Stephen repeats that word Egypt, as if he wants to make sure that those people who are listening to him hear and grasp the significance of that word. This Egypt was the country that was not their own, that they would go and spend 400 years in as slaves. Why God ever let that happen? Why did this happen? He goes, it's simple. It was because of the patriarch's jealousy of their younger brother, of Joseph, that migration ever took place. That they wound up bound as slaves in Egypt. And I wonder, what bondage could you and I avoid by submitting to the gospel instead of resisting it? What are we resisting that God might be trying to send to us so that we could avoid some kind of bondage? But the good news is, as we learn and we read and we follow along with the story of Joseph, is that even though Joseph's brothers resisted what God wanted to do through him, that God's mercy was still at work. That God was, that through the jealousy and through the resistance of the patriarchs, that God was patient, that he was merciful, and they kept on working for their deliverance. And I have this brain that goes, I want to go down a rabbit hole and go, but what if? Like, what if Joseph had never told them about these dreams? Like, that was kind of a little bit arrogant of him. What if dad had never, like, proven his favoritism by, telling him all the time and giving him this fancy coat? Like, what if that had never happened? Then would Joseph have actually wound up in the palace with Pharaoh in Egypt? Then would he have been able to deliver his family? I really don't know. I don't know. Like, God has not given me the answers. He's not in a box that I can say, well, here it is, God. This tells me what would have happened. But here is what I do know, is that even when Joseph was sold as a slave, even when it looked like the resistance had won, like that those who resisted God were going to be able to thwart him, were going to be able to stop what God wanted to do, we see that God was with him, that he rescued him from all his troubles, that he gave Joseph wisdom, and he enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And so Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all of his palace. See, if Joseph's story is a warning tale about what happens when we resist God, then we've got to ask the question, what causes us to resist God? And again, I love the I think when I read these things, I'm often tempted, as I said it before, I'm often tempted to put myself in the hero. Man, I'm Joseph. God's going to use me. I'm going to be the guy. But if you're tempted to believe like me that you would never miss what God is doing, I think we should sit together as we read this one. Because I think Stephen is pointing out that we, the religious, the ones who think we know it all, tend to be the ones who are the most at risk of missing God. See, it says pretty plain and clear in this story that the number one thing that was driving this was because of their jealousy. That Joseph's brothers, the patriarchs, the ones who resisted God, did so because they were jealous of him. And jealousy seems like the kind of thing that we should, like, send over to that other building, where the kids are for Sunday school. Like, little kids talk about jealousy, right? They're the ones who are jealous of toys. It doesn't happen to us. Not grown-ups, not adults like us. But I think you and I know that's not true. That jealousy is something that affects us in so many real ways that this summer alone, that, man, I know for me, the way that it touches me the most is when I try and scroll on Instagram. Like, I've been on a journey for the past, 6 months or so to just go, I don't want to be on any social media because I've noticed it's not good for my own mental health. Like, I've just got to be away from it. But I know that when I do it and I get on there, I'm scrolling and I go, man, how come I don't get to go on vacation like them? Man, how come I don't get a new car like they did? Man, how come I didn't get a new promotion at work like they did? Like, we see all of these things. Hey, how come I don't get to spend time on a boat all summer like they did? And these little things where we feel that jealousy, they begin to pop up. But maybe your jealousy isn't just in material things that you notice that other people have. Maybe you get it in a more intimate way. You see from photos, you see from what's going on to your friend's life. You go, man, how come my wife and I don't get along like they do? How come my kids don't respect me like these kids respect them? How come this person who's at work always gets all these opportunities and they're moving up and I never get seen? And we feel all of these things. And we can go on and on about the things that would cause us to feel jealous, the things that we notice in others and we wish that we could have. See, the interesting thing about jealousy is that psychologists who study the brain, they call it a secondary emotion. But that doesn't mean that it's secondary in that it's not as important, but it's secondary in that there's always a different emotion, a primary emotion underneath that's fueling it, that's driving it. And the two emotions they usually identify that will drive and fuel our jealousy are anger and fear. I'm afraid that I might not ever get what I see them with. What if there's not another opportunity that goes around for me? I'm afraid that my wife doesn't think I'm successful, or that my kids don't think I can provide as much, or that my boss will never notice me. Maybe I'm angry that it seems like they always get they always luck out. It always seems to work out for them, but it never seems to work out for me. See, what Stephen is pointing out in his sermon is that jealousy drove Joseph's brothers to resist a brother who they loved, the very one who God wanted to use to rescue them. James wrote it this way. He said it really simply. He said, you desire, but you don't have, so what do? You kill. And Stephen's connecting the dots for the Sanhedrin. He's connecting the dots for the religious people, that we, the religious, are often the ones who reject the saving and the delivery of God. But Jesus came so that he could rescue us from the power of sin. See, the religious people thought it was the way they kept the law. They thought it was the way they did everything right. They thought it was the way that they colored in the lines. They thought it was the way that they followed all the rules, that was what made them right and prevented them from the penalty of the sin of God. And they wanted to be really judgmental people who drew lines to keep other people out. But God had given his people the law, I was thinking about it this week as I studied this passage. God had given us the law, and the way it worked was this Old Testament system that none of us ever lived under, because it existed more than 2,000 years ago, was that when you would sin, that there was a predetermined, described sacrifice that you would bring to say, hey, I'm sorry for what I did. You would go, hey, if there was a little sin, I would bring maybe a fragrant offering. If it was a bigger sin, maybe I'd bring a little animal. And if there was an even bigger sin, I'd bring a bigger animal. And if you were Jake, you'd probably bring an elephant because you messed up so much. Like there was a different prescribed thing that you would bring to go, hey, I'm bringing my sacrifice to admit that there's sin in my life and that I need it covered, that the only thing that can pay the penalty for that sin is the death. That death would cover that. But they were never meant to be. It was never meant that little sacrifice that you would bring would cover your sin. That little sacrifice you brought was a daily and continual traditional reminder that God had promised that one day in the future that there would be a sacrificial offering that was so great that it would cover every sin that had ever existed and every sin that ever would. That he would send his son Jesus, and so it was merely a preview of what God was about to do. We all know that term preview, right? Like, how many of you guys have seen a movie trailer? Like a preview for a movie, you get hyped, you get excited. Like, I don't know what movie, my kids were just talking about the new Minions movie. They go, yeah, I saw the preview, it looks so good. I'm not a Minions guy, but my kids are like, this looks great. But as I was looking at previews this week, one of the greatest movie previews, arguably of all time, and you might fight me on this, was the preview for the Star Wars Episode 7, the first movie in the new Disney trilogy. It was this thing that announced that the story that we've grown up and we've loved is being continued, and people were excited about it. This was a preview that did not need a big introduction. People know who and what Star Wars is. It didn't need a big introduction, but this preview, this trailer, it was everywhere. It was because it was one of the biggest, most recognizable franchises in cinematic history that this thing comes out. And they didn't have to introduce a whole lot, but the creatives, the people who made it, they said, man, I really want to build hype. And so they took this and they did such a good job of creating excitement for what was coming. Because this preview, it balanced those old feelings that you get. Like maybe you had seen the original Star Wars when you were a kid. Maybe you had seen the second trilogy, the prequel that had come out years ago. And then it would build the excitement based on all that you loved from the old stuff. And then it would introduce the new cast and the characters who would star in this new movie. And you would hear that iconic soundtrack from John Williams and these incredible visuals from the updated technology. And you would get so excited. Whatever you think about Star Wars, there was this idea, man, the story that I've grown up, that I've known is being continued, and there was excitement built. But how crazy would it be if you were excited about this movie, you saw the preview, you brought your friends over, you said, you got to check out this preview, I'm so excited to go see this movie, and then you go and you see the movie, and you see it, and afterwards you keep going back to the preview. Like, that would be a weird thing if you're like, hey, the movie was great, do you want to watch the preview again? No. People, if you love a movie, you might watch that movie over and over. You probably have a movie go, I've watched this over and over again. It's so good. Maybe it's not Star Wars for you, but you go, I've watched this over and over again. But it would be strange. It would be weird. It would be wrong to go, I'd rather watch the preview than the real thing. See, that's what Stephen's pointing out to the Sanhedrin, to the religious. He's going, I don't think you understand. The system that we had, this religion that involved all the sacrifices, that was the preview of what God was about to do. But the real thing is here. That Jesus has come to be the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, that because of his sacrifice on the cross and because of what he has done, we no longer have to live in this old way of things. This is the end of religion. This system is dead and God has been fulfilled in who Jesus was. And I thought, I can understand that. I can understand that the religious people said, hey, that looks really good. I love what you're telling me, that there's something new, that there's a new covenant and a new agreement. But I think, like a lot of the religious people, sometimes we want to go back to the old way of doing things because I felt comfortable in it. I understood it. I knew what it meant. I knew where I stood. Like even me, I'd never lived under that sacrificial system. I can still go back and go, how great was it that there was a time that regularly and traditionally and weekly, I could come and I could offer this little thing, and it made me feel like I was right with God because I had offered this. And it was a continual reminder that believers had in their lives that someday there will be an offering that's so great that I won't need to do this again. And if you're like me, I need that reminder all the time, that there's sin in my life and that sin needs a sacrifice to pay for it. And I go, well, I can see how the religious are like, let's keep doing that. That was good. And yet what we have is we have something so new and so different, so beautiful. We practiced it this morning in communion. that we would go, hey, regularly as we come together as believers, let us pause and let us reflect and let us remember that there is sin in our lives, and the only reason that it's paid for, the only reason that we can know that we are right before God is because God sent his son Jesus to shed his blood and to bear our sins in his body for us. And it's our continual reminder that God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. It's that enables us to know that the opportunity that we have is to put our faith not in what God might do someday, but what God has already done. I love, there's a quote by Tim Keller that he's trying to paint the picture of what it looked like that Jesus had done. And he said this, he said, Jesus lost all of his glory so that we could be clothed in it. He was shut out so that we could get access. Jesus was bound and nailed so that we could be free. He was cast out so that we could approach. And Jesus took away the only kind of suffering that can really destroy you, and that is being cast away from God. But see, the problem is the religious people, they saw all that, they knew all that, and they still wanted to go back. They said, we've always done it this way. They were jealous that in this new covenant that their power structure had been torn down. They felt threatened, and their jealousy led them to reject the one who was sent to save them. They were jealous because it meant that they were out of a job. They were jealous because they felt excluded from what God was doing in this new way that he was working. There was something that you and I like about religion. It makes us want to go back to it, just like the Sanhedrin. We want to go back. It's the same way that sometimes we want to go back and watch the preview of the movie. We want to live the old way where I knew that this worked and I feel comfortable over here. See, I think the thing that you and I like about religion is our attempt to make God submit to us. Religion is our attempt to go, God, you promised and you said, if I do this, then you'll do this. Religion is our attempt to make God submit to us, but the gospel is God's invitation for us to submit to him. Like, I think of this all the time in my relationships. Clearest one is in my marriage. How many of you guys are married out there? A lot of us, right? How many of you have ever tried, husbands, how many of you have ever tried going to your wife and she's a little angry at you and go, honey, but I brought you flowers last Tuesday, right? I did this. You're not allowed to be mad. You laugh. You go, that would never work. Women are already laughing. And how many of you women, same thing. You go, honey, I took the trash out for you last week. You don't need to do it. You go, you can't be mad at me. Like, it doesn't work like that. We want religion because we want hey, I did this, so you have to. We want God to submit to us. There's a desire in us to have the other person submit, but that's religion. And Jesus says that there is an end to religion. You no longer have to attempt to make God submit to you because the gospel is the invitation for us to submit to him. The question is this, do you want to live a merely religious life that's dependent on your performance, or do you want to live one that's fully dependent on the performance of Jesus? Do you want to live a life that's dependent on your performance and what you've done, or do you want to live one that is fully dependent on the performance of Jesus? Now, the second thing that I see in this story that is affecting the religious people, whether you want to look at the Sanhedrin, or you want to look at Joseph's brothers, or you want to look at us when we're tempted to operate out of religion rather than relationship, is that what they did is they drew lines around where God worked. They said, God, this is how you've always worked, and this is the only way you can do it. See, in Joseph's dream, he told his brothers and his parents that one day that they were all going to bow down to him. And they replied, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. If your little brother, if your son came to you, 7-year-old, and said, hey, someday, Dad, you're all going to bow down to me. I'm going to be in charge. Dude, you're still going to bed. Like, that's not how this works. That's not how this works. They said, listen, there are lines. Like, you are in line. You are 12th in line to inherit what God has. There are 12 of us, and that means there are 11 older brothers who are going to inherit what God has way before you ever get the chance to inherit what God has that you would rule over us. You got to get in line, little Joey. There is a way things are done. Firstborns lead families, not 12th-borns. See, they had a line, and they liked it, and they said, this is the only way it can work. The Sanhedrin, the religious leaders, they were the same way. They had the same reaction to Jesus. They're talking to Stephen and they're saying, Stephen, you are disrespecting the temple and this place. How do you answer for that? And he's pointing at Jesus and going, didn't you see what Jesus did? He changed everything. In John chapter 2, there's a story of Jesus being in the temple. It's one that many of us are familiar with. He goes into the temple and he sees this marketplace set up in God's temple, that they are selling these different animals for the sacrifice system, and he is ticked off. And so he flips tables. He gets a whip out. He goes, not in my house. And he can say that. It's his. He goes, this is not how it was meant to be done. He's angry. And part of me is like, I like this Jesus. He's exciting, you know? This is action figure Jesus here. But then there was another part of me that, like, if I'm honest, I grew up in churches that had merch shops, you know, and had cafes that sold you bagels. And I'm like, Is that us? Like, is that what he's mad about? Because, like, we sell that dope Folsom fan merch, And I go, that's not what's happening here. Like, if you look closer, Jesus is not upset that something's being sold. He's upset that in the church, that they're being taken advantage of by the church. In the temple, people are being taken advantage of by the temple. It's like when you go to the airport and you need coffee because it was really early before your flight, and your coffee that's normally $4 that already costs too much, now it's $19 at the airport, and you're like, I'm getting ripped off here. That's what was happening in the temple. Is they would walk into the temple, it'd be like if you were here and you came in, and at the door we wanted to sell you a Bible, and you're like, I brought a Bible, and we're like, oh, we don't use that version. Well, what version? We use a special Folsom version. We print a new one every week. You got to buy one. They're $35. And you're like, what? Excuse me? And you don't get the chance. It's not like here where you're like, all right, that's cool. I'm going to go jump back in my car with the AC and drive home for 8 minutes. You're like, no, I got to go back on my camel, and I got to go on a 2-week journey to get back home to my village. He said people were being ripped off. They were being taken advantage of by the temple in this place, and it infuriated him. It made him angry. And so Jesus, they said, who are you, Jesus? This is the way it's always been done. Get in line. We got a whole list of priests and Levites. They're in charge, not you. What sign do you have? Can you prove to us that you have any authority here? And Jesus responds, he simply says, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And the people are like, are you crazy? It took 46 years to build this temple. This temple built of stone and brick and gold. This house of God, 46 years, you're going to rebuild it in 3 days? Are you kidding me? But Jesus wasn't talking about a building. He was talking about himself. He says, I'm going to be killed. That's where this is headed. And you're going to see that the miracle, it'd be a miracle if a building went up quicker than you expected, right? When Chick-fil-A gets open 3 days before you thought, you're so excited. But imagine better than a building being built quicker than you thought, that Jesus is referring to himself, his body, and he says that I'm going to be dead and buried in a grave, and you're going to see me crucified, but 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. That's your sign. That's your proof. That's how you know that this is the end of religion. That's how you know. See, Jesus said, I'm going to destroy this temple, and I'm going to rebuild one that's not made with hands. He meant that he would destroy this kind of religion. And some of us get stuck. We just love looking at, man, there's a certain way that God's done things. There's a way that he's always done things, and we draw these lines. And I think that's what happens. See, religion draws lines that keep people out. They say, I'm sorry, we drew a line here, and you're not meeting up. Go back home, go get the real Bible, go do it the right way, go clean yourself up, and then come back here. Man, and even as I just said, it's so hurtful. Religion draws lines that keep people out, but Jesus says, I want to cross lines to bring people in. I want to cross lines so that I can bring people in. But we're tempted. Why are we tempted? To go back to this religion, to this way of just knowing, man, I feel more comfortable and more confident knowing that God's always worked this way, and that's the way he's going to continue to work. But what if Bayside Folsom? What if instead of being people that were known for drawing lines that keep people out, that we were the kind of people that crossed lines to invite people in? Would you guys bow your heads with me for a moment? See, I think that there's people in this room who maybe you've only ever known it as religion. Maybe your idea of church, your idea of Bayside, your idea of Jesus it's only ever been presented to you as religion, that there's this system of rules that you need to follow to be good enough so that you can get to God. But today I would hope that maybe there's somebody in here who's discovering, maybe even for the first time, that God has crossed all those lines so that he could get to you. And I want to invite you this morning, if that's you, that you're discovering that it's not about a religion, that it's about a relationship, that you would pray a prayer with me. There's nothing special about these words. There's no tricks here. It's just simply this prayer that believers have been praying for some 2,000 years as they've discovered the love and the sacrifice of Jesus, as they've asked Jesus to have not just a place in their life, but to have a place over their life as they submit to him. And so this morning, if that's you, if today's the first time that you want to invite Jesus to be your Lord, then just where you're at in the quiet of this place, would you pray along with me this prayer? Would you say, Jesus, thank you for loving me. Thank you for coming to the earth and living a perfect, sinless life, that you died on the cross as a payment for my sins. I believe that you were raised from the dead, proving that you are God. And today I want to submit my life to you as my Lord. I ask that you would come into my life, that you would have your way in me, that you would transform me, and that you would help me to follow you all the days of my life. I just want to invite you to keep your eyes closed, your heads bowed. If you're in this room, and maybe you prayed that prayer with me, and it was the first time you've ever done that, I want you to know that here around our church, around Bayside, we think that's a big deal. We think that the transformation that's happening in your heart is so big that it's going to have such a huge impact and lasting and generationally that we want to celebrate it, that we want to know so that we can pray with you as you step into this new journey. And so I'm going to ask everyone to keep your eyes closed, your heads bowed, and if you prayed that prayer with me now, I don't want to embarrass you, I don't want to single you out, I just want to know who you are so that I could be praying for you. Would you just quietly just slip your hand up so that I could see it? Would you raise it up nice and high and just let me know? I see you. See that hand? I see hands all around the room. I love knowing what God is doing. And so as you guys just slip those hands down, I want to pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for the way that you are at work in our church, the way that you are at work in each of these people's lives who've raised their hand, who have said, I'm tired of religion. That's not the way I'm going to operate. I'm not going to cling to and go back to trying to do it on my own. But Jesus, I believe that you put an end to religion, that your life and death and resurrection prove that you've paved the way for me. So Jesus, we thank you for what you're doing here in our lives and in the lives of these people who are taking those steps. Thank you that you have freed us from the bonds of religion. Lord, would you help us to remember that as we leave here today, that we don't want to simply or merely live religious lives that are dependent on our performance. But Jesus, we want to live as people who are fully dependent on the performance of you. May we be a people who don't draw lines that keep people out, but who are constantly crossing lines to invite people in to that sweet life that we enjoy as we walk alongside you. Lord, we love you, we praise you. It's in your name that we pray these things. And all God's people said, amen.